April 27th, 1865. At 2 in the morning, on the Mississippi River 7 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, a 21-year-old Union soldier named Chester Berry is asleep on the deck of the steamboat Sultana. He is lying on bare wood because there is no other option. The men around him are packed so tightly there is no room to turn over. He has been asleep for hours. He does not feel the river moving beneath him. He does not hear the boilers working at the stern. He has survived Andersonville, 10 months in the worst prison camp in the Confederacy, the open stockade in Georgia, where 45,000 Union soldiers were held in a space built for 10,000, where men died of dysentery, scurvy, and starvation at a rate that would not be equaled in American captivity until the 20th century. Chester Berry went in weighing a soldier's weight. He came out unable to stand without help. He was released on April 1st. He reached Vicksburg on the same day. He boarded the Sultana on April the 24th. He is 3 days from Michigan, 3 days from his mother, 3 days from the end of everything the war put him through. At 2 in the morning on April 27th, 1865, 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers detonate simultaneously. The explosion tears through the center of the ship and throws Chester Berry into the Mississippi River before he is fully awake. In the water around him are an estimated 2,000 men. The river is running fast with spring floodwater, cold and dark and wide. Most of the men in it survived Andersonville. Most of them cannot swim. The nearest shore is half a mile away. An estimated 1,800 of them will be dead before morning, the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. And within 48 hours of it happening, the newspapers will have moved on, not because the story was small, because history had no room for it. April 9th, 1865. Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee signed the terms of surrender handed to him by Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War was over. 4 years and 620,000 dead. A country torn in two and stitched back together with blood and federal authority. It was over. In the Confederate prison camps scattered across Georgia and Alabama, the news arrived within days. The gates of Andersonville opened. The gates of Cahaba, the prison camp outside Selma, Alabama, where 5,000 Union soldiers had been held in a converted warehouse never designed for the purpose, opened. The men inside, what was left of them, were told they were free. They had to get home first. Tens of thousands of Union prisoners of war needed to travel north. Most were from the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois. The logical route was the Mississippi River. Steamboats north from Vicksburg to Memphis, then upriver to Cairo, and from there to the tributaries that fed the towns they had come from. The Union Army needed to move them fast. These men were sick, starving, and dying at a rate that continued even after the camps opened. Every day of delay was more men lost. The government had a mechanism for this. Steamboat operators contracted with the Union Army to carry passengers up the Mississippi. The rate was fixed: $5 per enlisted man, $8 per officer. It was a significant contract for any boat that secured it. And at Vicksburg in April 1865, the man who controlled which boats received that contract was an Army quartermaster named Captain Reuben Hatch. Hatch had the power to assign the released prisoners to whichever vessels he chose. He was not using that power impartially. He had a relationship with the captain of the Sultana, a man named James Mason, and an arrangement that benefited them both. The more men loaded onto Mason's boat, the larger the government payment. The split of that payment was between 2 men. The men being loaded had no part in the conversation. The Confederate prison camps had already taken everything from the men walking down the bluff at Vicksburg toward the river. What waited for them at the dock was a transaction they knew nothing about. Chester Berry described the mood on the dock. He wrote later that he had never seen a happier group of men. They had been in prison for months, some for nearly 2 years. The prospect of going home made them willing to endure anything, any amount of crowding, any discomfort. They were going home. Nothing else mattered. The Sultana had been built in 1863 at the John Litherbury Shipyard in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was a side-wheel steamboat, 260 feet long, powered by 4 fire-tube boilers that drove her paddle wheels through the water at a working speed of about 9 miles per hour. She was a commercial vessel, cotton, freight, passengers, built for the trade of the lower Mississippi between New Orleans and St. Louis. She was licensed to carry 376 people. She was not a new boat when she arrived at Vicksburg on April 23, 1865. 2 years on the Mississippi River, working cargo and passengers through the latter years of the war, had put hours on her machinery. The boilers had been serviced and repaired across multiple seasons. By the time she docked at Vicksburg, one of them, the middle larboard boiler on the port side, had developed a crack, not a small crack. A bulge and a crack in the boiler seam that was visible to anyone who looked at it directly. Captain Mason knew it. He had been told by his own engineers before the boat reached Vicksburg. The correct repair was a full replacement of the damaged section, pulling the boiler, opening the seam, and re-rolling the metal, a repair that would take days and cost the contract. Mason was already in financial difficulty. He had been counting on the Vicksburg run. He authorized a patch instead. A local boilermaker named R.G. Taylor was brought on board. Taylor sheeted over the crack with a thinner piece of metal, bolted it in place, and pronounced the repair complete. The work took less than a day. 2 engineers who inspected the patch warned Mason directly. The sheet metal used was thinner than the surrounding boiler wall. Under the pressure of a full load on a fast river, it would not hold. Mason thanked them. He gave the order to begin loading. The patch held while the boat was at dock. It held while the river was calm. It had never been tested at full boiler pressure with 2,000 men aboard on a flooded spring Mississippi running faster than normal. It would be tested on the night of April the 27th. The loading began on April 24th. The men coming down the bluff from the parole camp at Vicksburg were not what a healthy crowd looked like. Andersonville had held 45,000 men at its peak, in a stockade built for 10,000. The men who had survived it were skeletal, many still suffering from dysentery and scurvy, some being helped down the slope by the men alongside them. The Cahaba prisoners were in marginally better condition. The camp had been an overcrowded converted warehouse, but the death rate had been lower. But they were still weakened men who had spent months on inadequate food in inadequate conditions. They came aboard the Sultana in groups, regiment by regiment, as the army mustered them out and sent them to the dock. In the first hours, officers on the dock raised objections. The Sultana was visibly settling lower in the water with every additional group that boarded. Her main deck, observers would later testify, was barely above the river's surface before loading was complete. The objections were noted. The loading continued. Chester Berry wrote that on the lower deck where he was standing, the men were packed as thick as they could possibly lie. Every deck was the same. The corridors, the stairwells, the open spaces between the machinery, every flat surface on the Sultana had a man on it. The final count is disputed. Estimates range from 2,100 to 2,400. What is certain is that the Sultana was carrying between 6 and 7 times her licensed capacity. The government was paying Mason and Hatch for every one of them. On the evening of April 24th, the Sultana departed Vicksburg heading north. She stopped at Memphis on April 26th to unload a cargo of sugar and take on coal. Passengers who were mobile enough went ashore for a few hours. Chester Berry walked the streets of Memphis. He had not been in a city in 10 months. He reboarded that evening. The Sultana pulled away from Memphis and headed upriver into the dark. The Mississippi was running at spring flood, wide, fast, higher than its banks along the low-lying stretches to the north. The current was against them. The boilers were working hard. Home was 3 days away. Ohio was 3 days away. Indiana was 3 days away. Michigan was 3 days away. The men on the decks settled in for the night. 7 miles north of Memphis, the Sultana was passing a stretch of flooded river near a cluster of small islands called the Hen and Chickens. The banks on both sides were submerged. The spring flood had pushed the Mississippi half a mile beyond its normal course in both directions. The trees on the flooded margins stood in several feet of water. The river was half a mile wide where it was normally 100 yards. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 of the 4 boilers detonated within seconds of each other. The force of the explosion tore through the center of the ship. The boiler deck disintegrated. The upper decks collapsed into the fireball. The 2 smokestacks fell. Men who were asleep were thrown into the air and into the river before the sound had finished moving across the water. The Sultana's wooden superstructure caught fire immediately. Dry timber soaked in boiler steam, igniting in the heat of 3 simultaneous detonations. Chester Berry was thrown into the Mississippi. He did not know, in those first seconds, what had happened. He knew he was in the water, and the water was cold, and the current was pulling him downstream toward Memphis. He knew his head was bleeding. He would later learn that his skull had been fractured by the force of the explosion. Around him, in the dark, 2,000 men were in the river. The water was cold. The current was fast. The nearest bank, submerged, tree-lined, half a mile away through floodwater, was the only option. Men who could not swim drowned within minutes. Men who could swim but were too weakened by months of captivity drowned before they reached anything solid. Men who reached the trees in the flooded margins clung to the branches in the dark and waited for something to come. The Sultana burned. She drifted south with the current as she went down, illuminating the river around her. Survivors who had made it to the trees watched the burning boat float past them in the night. A few tried to swim back toward her for the light and the wreckage and drowned in the attempt. Those who stayed in the trees held on. In Memphis, the sentries on the waterfront saw the fire in the distance. A teenage boy, a Sultana passenger who had floated 7 miles downstream clinging to debris, reached the bank and told them what had happened. The alarm went out. Rescue boats launched from Memphis into the dark, moving upstream against the current toward the fire. They found men in the water, men on wreckage, men clinging to trees in 6 feet of floodwater. Along the submerged banks, some of them having held their grip for 2, 3, 4 hours in the cold. The rescue went on through the night and into the morning. Some of the men pulled from the river were burned beyond identification. Some were hypothermic, barely conscious. Some were pulled off tree branches, still wearing their prison camp clothes, having survived Andersonville and the river both. Chester Berry attracted the attention of a passing rescue boat. He was pulled from the water and taken to the Washington Hospital in Memphis. The surgeons who examined him told the man in the adjacent bunk that he could not possibly recover. His mother, in Michigan, received official notice from Washington that her son had been killed in the explosion of the Sultana. His name was entered in the Michigan Adjutant General's report as dead. He was not dead, but of the estimated 2,000 men in the Mississippi River that morning, the majority were. The investigations began while the survivors were still in the Memphis hospitals. The Army convened an inquiry. The facts were not disputed. The boiler had been cracked. The patch had been insufficient. The ship had been loaded to more than 6 times her licensed capacity. The quartermaster at Vicksburg had controlled the assignment of prisoners to the Sultana and had a financial relationship with her captain. Captain Mason was dead. His body went into the Mississippi with the ship and was never recovered. But Reuben Hatch was alive, and the testimony against him was direct. Hatch was court-martialed. The evidence of his arrangement with Mason was placed in the record. Witnesses testified to the overcrowding, to the objections that had been raised and ignored, to the financial logic that had put 2,000 men on a boat built for 376. He was acquitted. His political connections, Hatch had a brother with influence in Washington, proved more durable than the evidence. The charges were dismissed. The boilermaker who had patched the crack was interviewed and never charged. The Army officers who had signed off on the loading without questioning the numbers were noted in the record and suffered no consequence. The story did not outlast the acquittal. Lincoln had been shot on the evening of April 14th. He died on the morning of April 15th, 12 days before the Sultana exploded. John Wilkes Booth was tracked to a barn in Virginia and shot dead on April 26th, the day before. On the morning of April 27th, 1865, every newspaper in America led with the same story. The manhunt was over, the conspirators were in custody, the nation's grief was moving toward resolution. The Sultana appeared in some editions as a single column on an inside page. The New York Times ran a brief notice. Within a week, it had vanished from print entirely. The country had no attention left. It had spent everything it had on 4 years of war, and the murder of the man who had carried it through. There was nothing remaining for a steamboat. The men who had survived Andersonville and the river filed their pension claims, returned to their towns, and tried to rebuild lives that the war had interrupted. Chester Berry spent years trying to prove to the government's satisfaction that he had actually been on the Sultana, that his fractured skull was a real injury sustained in a real disaster, that he was not, despite the official record, dead. He eventually succeeded. He spent the rest of his life collecting the accounts of the survivors. In 1892, he published them. 125 first-hand testimonies, the only major record of what happened on the Mississippi River on the night of April 27, 1865. Chester Berry survived. He carried the fractured skull for the rest of his life, proof that the government's official record of his death was wrong. He died in 1922, 57 years after the night the Sultana went down. The death toll has never been precisely established. The manifest was lost with the ship. The men had been loaded without a complete count. The Army's official figure was 1,238 dead. Historians who have studied the records in the century since put the real number at between 1,500 and 1,800. An unknown number of bodies were carried past Memphis by the current and were never found. The Mississippi, like Lake Superior, does not always give back what it takes. No one was ever convicted of anything. 1,800 dead, 3 days from home, swallowed by a river they had never been afraid of, on a boat they had trusted, in a country whose war they had just survived. The Titanic has a museum. The Edmund Fitzgerald has a song. The Sultana has Chester Berry's book, published in 1892, and a small memorial in Memphis that most people walk past without knowing what it marks. It is the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, and almost nobody knows its name.